believe we are live. Fantastic. I'm Linnea Irvin, president of COCOL, formerly the Center for Talent Innovation, a think tank that conducts research and advises companies on diversity, equity, and inclusion globally. I'm excited to keep up the momentum and excited to be joined by a great lineup of speakers today. It should be an exciting and interesting exchange of ideas. In this current context, though, I do want to do some grounding. We find ourselves in a moment of tremendous pain and complexity globally. Current crises have shined light on inequities that have existed for far too long. During this global health pandemic and severe economic shutdowns, you have millions of people all over the world who've experienced rapid human loss, death, unemployment, food insecurity, and with the current reckoning on race and systemic racism, we're very quickly having to learn global history of injustice so that we can talk about it, so that we might act differently as individuals, as company leaders, as activists. So as I mentioned today, I am joined by several dynamic queer movement leaders. And they should bring unique perspectives, no doubt. I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce each of these panelists. First, Bev Tillery, who is the executive director of the New York City Anti-Violence Project, an organization that empowers LGBTQ and HIV-affected communities and allies to end all forms of violence through organizing and education. And the organization supports survivors through counseling and advocacy. Previously, Bev was Deputy Director of Education and Public Affairs at Lambda Legal, an organization dedicated to achieving full recognition of LGBTQ people and people living with HIV. She's also held leadership positions at Amnesty International, Service Employees International Union, and ACORN. So we're delighted to have Bev. We also have Amir Ashur. Amir is an Iraqi human rights defender with over a decade of experience working with international organizations. He is the founder and executive director of Iraqqueer, Iraq's first national LGBTQ+ organization. Amir was an honoree by the XQ Gay Gala of the XQ Gay Gala in Sweden, and he's been nominated for numerous awards, including the Raoul Wallenberg Academy Prize and the David Cato Voice and Vision Award. Ifashina Efudemi is a human rights defender and advocate, an educator, journalist, writer, and poet from Belize. She co-founded the Productive Organization for Women in Action, POWA. She also co-founded PETAL, a women's organization promoting empowerment through awareness for lesbian and bisexual women. As a result of her activism, in 2019, she was awarded the United Nations Religion Fellowship by Outright Action International, and was also recognized by the Women and Family Support Department in Belize for her outstanding contributions to the Belizean community. And finally, Dr. Beverly Ditsey. Beverly is an award-winning filmmaker, musician, social justice change agent, who's been instrumental in bringing LGBTQ+ rights in focus in the late 80s and 90s in South Africa and all over the world. She was a founding member of the first multiracial LGBTQIA organization in South Africa, GLOW. She's also known for being the first African lesbian to address the UN at the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, 1995, the subject of some of her recent work. Her documentary films have received numerous awards, and we're looking forward to hearing from her what she's working on right now, which is great. So welcome to each of the panelists. Thank you all for joining us today. Delighted to be here with each of you and eager to jump right in. So
thank you.
I'll start with Beverly Ditsey. So we're talking about, movements for liberation, LGBTQ activism, and racial justice. What does this title mean to you and your work?
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I think good day, good evening. It's evening for me in Johannesburg. I'm very excited to be here. I think you're talking to me, right, Lenaya?
Yes.
Beverly Ditsey. Yeah, of course. So I would like to, I think ground this and start off by talking a little bit about South Africa and where we are today and where we come from as a country that recently, and I say recently because it may be a long while ago, but actually it is quite recent, come from institutionalized racism, which was called apartheid. And it is assumed that currently, because the legal institutionalized apartheid and racism is over, that we are now past the worst and we are now in a new rainbow dispensation where none of that is happening. But when I read the subject of this panel and this conversation, it evoked such emotions for me because we're living in such deep systemic racism in South Africa. And of course, in the rest of the world too. But how it's rearing its head currently is that we have both economic and racial injustice that just continues unabated. And of course, if you're talking the queer community and the LGBTIQ folk, we are even more divided than I remember, having been a part of the first multiracial organization in South Africa in the early 90s, and having experienced the amount of solidarity and unity that we had across the different races, across different genders, across different economic statuses. And now we find ourselves even more divided to a degree where there isn't much that happens where you find a racial mix. And in fact, we're finding a lot more discrimination, particularly from our white queer counterparts, than we have ever experienced. And so this subject is one that's very close to my heart. I find that it is, in fact, someone once actually was every year in October, which is South Africa's Pride, I get questions and I get media and different people want to talk to me about Pride and how Pride has become such a very kind of white event where there is very little participation from Black queer folk. And the politics of Pride are steeped in the racial injustices and the racism that is still South Africa currently. And we cannot divorce that. We cannot remove ourselves from the rest of what's happening in general society. And it is unfortunate we are part of the same society, even as queer people. And so everything that we do remains intrinsically a part of this issue. So it resonated because I am sitting in a space where we are trying to deal with so many systemic issues, including racism. Can't hear you.
Given AVP's critical work, sorry, I was looking to point this question to Bev, and thank you for that, Beverly Ditsey. Really anchoring, I think what a lot of us have been feeling, especially this year, come Pride, right? Those divisions and where parts of the community are steeped in racism. Bev Tillery, given the work of AVP, the critical work supporting survivors of violence, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that work. Talk to me about this moment of obviously reckoning with race, but what vulnerabilities have you seen within the community during this current context, and how has the organization taken a stance on racial justice in 2020?
Yeah, I would say, you know, one of the things that we have seen in our work at AVP is that when you talk about the vulnerabilities, those are, you know, as I think we all know intuitively that the people who are already the most marginalized and most impacted by violence are again most impacted in times like these when there is a crisis. And we're seeing that over and over again. And you know, we're really seeing intersectionality playing out. And, you know, I think there's been a lot of conversation about intersectionality, but what that really means simply to me is that those folks who are holding multiple identities that are already marginalized are impacted by discrimination and violence in deeper ways and sometimes different ways. And so for across the community, we're seeing huge impacts with COVID, but particularly for people who are queer people of color, immigrants, indigenous folks, Black folks, of course, trans and gender nonconforming folks. And you know, it starts with really just I think, anxiety and trauma that comes when there are these times where people who are already dealing with violence and discrimination know and are anticipating how that is going to impact them in their lives. We often, when there's time of crisis, we'll have people calling our hotline or who are already clients of our organization who talk about the fact that the stress of the times, and this definitely happened with COVID, brings up the trauma of past incidents of violence, whether it's childhood violence or family violence or hate violence. So that anxiety is one of the first things that we see. Related to that, we saw increased suicidality among community members who, you know, the impact of the isolation of quarantine was impacting folks. And then a lot of people who were impacted by, as you said earlier, Linnea, the lack of basic needs and services that they relied on every day to survive. So loss of employment, lack of housing, shelter, access to safe shelter, all those things that are already realities for our community were impounded. You know, so we saw more people who are homeless or people who are already homeless really struggling about where they could find safety, safe shelter, where they were not going to be exposed to COVID. We saw increased police activity as our city, New York City, and other cities were starting to shut down. Those people who are homeless, who were more marginalized, were being targeted by police. And then you know, there's so many issues, but then the last one that I will mention is the increased violence that was caused by people having to shelter in place with people who caused them harm. And not just intimate partner violence that we heard a lot of conversation about, but also hate violence for members of our community as well, who were forced to stay in very close quarters with people who are not affirming, who do not respect their identities. And that violence came from family members, came from roommates, in some cases came from landlords. We had a lot of stories of violence from landlords, you know, whether it was intimidation, sexual violence, and other kinds of violence. So just really across the board, an increased sense of insecurity, of violence, of anxiety, isolation, and fear, and a lot less resources to access because of COVID and how organizations and services were impacted across the board.
Thank you for that perspective. You brought up this, this observation of obviously increased policing. We saw that here in New York and elsewhere. Has anybody else, experienced in your communities increased policing, or to Bev's point, this increased violence related to shelter in place and being our members of our community being forced, obviously, to shelter with those who might not be as welcoming? Well, if no one wants to pick that up, I can. Okay, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously a lot of the points. One of the good things about being in a star-studded panel with people like my colleagues here is that they've already talked a lot about what has been happening. But I think in Iraq specifically, we've definitely seen not necessarily an increased level of policing against LGBT plus people and an increasing level of lack of needs and providing these needs, but actually more invisibility of the discrimination that's happening, because it's even more difficult to report on these violations than it was before COVID. In normal times, if there was some kind of killing or some kind of violation happening against LGBT plus people in Iraq, we would be sending colleagues to certain neighborhoods and areas where those crimes have taken place to casually document these crimes. But during COVID, with the restrictions and the lockdown and the different rules that are imposed in Iraq, the colleagues are not able to go to these areas, which means a lot of these crimes have actually gone not only unpunished, which is the normal reality, but also undocumented. So in May of this year, for International Day Against Queerphobia, and I use queer as an umbrella term here, we have had reports of more than 40 killings. We've been able to only document nine of those killings because of these restrictions. And to Bev's point earlier regarding housing, it's certainly been a huge problem for queer Iraqis, especially those who have been forced to quarantine with abusive families or with hosts who are threatening that they will either out them or they will be kicked or they have to leave. At Iraq, where we've been able to provide temporary housing with the support of Outright. I was listening to an earlier panel where they spoke about similar efforts. So we're thankful that we had that opportunity. But as you know, the need for housing is, one of the most basic human rights, and it's not a temporary need. It's something that is a constant need, and it again didn't arise with COVID. It just made it more visible. Because in times before COVID, if people could simply go and stay with friends, go out of the house for a few hours every day, during COVID, you didn't even have these small opportunities to just release the stress and the pressure that you're facing by whoever is discriminating against you and practicing both verbal and physical violence against you.
Thank you for that, Amir. Ifashina, obviously, I would love to hear from you as an advocate and a leader, of course, in your community. Speak to us about, the state of the LGBTQ plus community, state of racism and injustice in Belize, inequities that you're seeing the community face during this current time. I know we talked about that a bit last week.
Well, mabuga honso agamba hatia I greet you in the language of my ancestors as a Garifuna woman. And a Garifuna is a person who has African ancestry along with indigenous ancestry of the Caribbean, Kalinago and Arawak specifically. And this union occurred in Euromay, which is St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And we were exiled from there by the British in 1797 after years of battling with them because, of course, they wanted our land for their exploitation of its resources. And so despite the genocide that they committed against my people, we have survived and are now located in Central America, with Belize being one of the countries where you can find Garifuna communities, as well as, of course, in Honduras, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. And then there is a large Garifuna population in the United States. And being a descendant of these people that had to survive that kind of attack that many African groups have experienced, the fact that we have been able to survive already speaks to our tenacity as a people, but the consistent struggle that we've had to deal with to be even free and living as we are in our country and in each of the countries that we occupy. Now, when you bring it down to the Belizean context, once we came here in 1802 as free laborers, we were in contact with the other Afro-descendant group of this country, being the Creoles. And what the British did was use propaganda to separate the two groups because, of course, they did not want for Garinago to unite with Creoles in order to free them from enslavement or to engage in a lot of revolts. And so a part of the propaganda was to cause the Creole population to see the Garifuna population as devil worshippers because we honor our ancestors, and so they use that, their religion, to speak against Garifuna people and to create that divide between the two groups. Now, interestingly, when you look at all the negative things that occur in our country, so for example, unemployment, rates of HIV infection, incarceration, violent crime, urban poverty, dropping out of school, underachievement academically. In all of those areas, it is the same two Afro-descendant groups of this country that are united. We are affected in the very same way by all of those issues, even though that conscious effort had been made throughout our history, and it still exists to a certain extent presently, to separate us. When it comes to the negative impacts of all, once you look at how capitalism affects people, we are united in that way because we are affected the same way. And it isn't a coincidence, of course, that this is the reality in our country. So then when you add LGBTIQ to the equation, that only increases the vulnerability, the discrimination, the negative impact. And COVID-19 has compounded those issues. We were just in a discussion yesterday or the day before about how the LGBT plus community has been affected by COVID-19. And similar to what Beverly Tillery had spoken of earlier, those issues, even though they were already a concern for the population prior to COVID-19, that experience has doubled, tripled in some situations. And I take this opportunity to remember persons like Desmond Lewis, who was a very impactful educator, found murdered. Vanessa Champagne, who was attacked on the streets and now is not with us anymore. Ulysses Roca, earlier this year, a fashion designer, also found dead in his home. And his case particularly was connected to COVID-19 because he was taken into custody by the police and actually violated by the police because he had violated the restrictions, not the quarantine, but you couldn't be on the street at a certain time. And so he was arrested for that. But while in police custody, he was insulted, and then the video of that was made viral. And then he was also subjected to violence, and because he could not access healthcare, he ended up succumbing to his injuries. And these kinds of cases often go without any justice at all. And people behave as if though when you're talking about the rights of these particular human beings, like you're talking about special rights. So we have the conservative evangelicals pushing their campaign in our country, pushing their poison in our country, talking about LGBT persons don't deserve any rights. They're talking about because we've been trying to get the Equal Opportunities Bill passed, and they influenced the government prior to elections that just happened to put that on pause. And now the challenge is to get the current government, the new government, to pass that bill, which it has 19 protected characteristics, and those characteristics that are associated with LGBT plus persons are the minority. But yet what the churches did was make it appear as if though equal opportunities was only an agenda of LGBT persons, not recognizing, for example, the extent of discrimination that women face, the extent of discrimination that people face for being Afro-descendant, the extent of discrimination that people face for having special needs, having some kind of disability, and the list went on. It's 19 protected characteristics, but they pushed that it was an LGBT bill and therefore should not be passed. So when it comes to the protection of the rights of the LGBT plus population, there is a divide, there is a pretense.
Well, we'll see if Ashina comes back. I believe that she's frozen on our end. She'll likely dial back in, but we'll continue the conversation. She brought up, kind of this idea of, and she outlined how there was this conscious effort to create this division in the Belizean community. When we connected previously, Beverly Ditzy, you spoke about how race and class have become such a big divider in the community in South Africa. Talk to us about how this shows up in general in South Africa, but also how race and class really divide and show up in the LGBTQ community as well. You alluded to it, but given the current state of the community, I'd love to hear your perspectives and some storytelling there.
Thank you. I think it's sad just listening to Fania, how insidious racism actually is, and how we are constantly divided and and also, even in our own protection of ourselves, having our own communities in an attempt to build ourselves and not really worry so much about what's going on the outside. We find ourselves isolated in the work that we do or the work that we try to do. Some of the injustice that we are facing is overt and very, very obvious. Whether we're talking about the racial injustice of the courts finding murderers not guilty. And this is just something that happened in just the last 2 weeks alone. There's been very big cases in South Africa, very high-profile cases of white men who have murdered young Black boys, Black women, and they are found not guilty, or that there isn't enough evidence, even when there is images and video of and I mean, obviously this is happening worldwide. But just to take it back a little bit in how it connects with how this is affecting us as a queer community. At the end of the middle of the 90s, after the adoption of the Constitution of South Africa, which was one of the first constitutions to include sexual orientation in the Bill of Rights, I was part of an organization that went around doing sensitization work and consciousness raising work amongst different institutions. And in this one particular one, I went to a workshop that was being done with the police services. And I think that was the first time I realized the depth that we are dealing with. In this workshop, I arrived to find a white gay man running the workshop with the national police commissioners and heads of the police stations throughout the country. There were about 120 different people in the room, most of whom were Black police commissioners. And in that workshop for that day, I was listening to him talking about the needs of gay men, and it was particular to white gay men, about how they needed protection in the parks while cruising, how they needed the different types of protections, how they discriminated against. And during lunch, one of the police commissioners said, so, why are you here? Are you taking notes? I'm like, well, I'm part of the queer community and we live in the townships. And in the township police stations, we can't even go to the police station because we are either laughed out of the police station or we are even further discriminated against in these spaces. And the police constable laughed and said, what do you mean you're part of this community? There are no African gay people. So, and I think I'm using this as an example because if this was a national drive to bring awareness and conscientize and bring sensitivity to different institutions in the country, and it was being run by gay white men, what that meant is that we continue to be invisible. And the more invisibilized we are as Black and brown queer people means that we continue to be discriminated. And so there is a very big difference in how, even now during COVID, the treatment of our white siblings is versus the rest of us. If you are, obviously the spatial apartheid is something that did not end at the end of apartheid. Poor people are still living in the same spaces that they've been living. The divide continues to even be wider. And what that then means is that there's a deep lack of access to, whether it is hospitals, whether it is simple drinking water, which is a basic human right. Housing, as Bev was saying, is a basic human right. All those things are very difficult to access when you are poor and when you are Black and when you are living in spaces that are very underserviced. And so how this translates to the rest of us is that while we've been living in post-apartheid, it's then compounded as everyone else has been saying. And unfortunately, we're also in a situation in our country where there's very little access to services, particularly for poor people. So we have organizations that exist, but if you're talking about the 5 organizations that exist nationally, you're talking about very little access for the rest of the country to be able to gain any kind of help in any way. So once, I keep getting inboxes, whether it's on social media or people coming to me directly and saying, help, I'm being kicked out because I can't pay for the back room where I stay because I am now unemployed because of COVID. There is no housing. And I understand that there was a whole conversation with the Ministry of Social Services and Housing, and they did not even include the LGBTIQA community as part of special needs. And this happened about 3 weeks ago. And those who were our queer siblings who were in the space had to fight to even be heard that, we also exist and we are just as marginalized and just as vulnerable. And so it looks bleak. It's bleak in that systemic racism lives with us. We live with it. And so we continue to do the best that we can for our communities and the best, because what else is there to do except for do the best that we can?
Well, what else is there to do? I think what we're hearing, and what we're seeing in 2020 is, a collective kind of outcry and push against that invisibility, right? The persistent discrimination. I know here domestically, following the killing of George Floyd, I pinned a piece in Newsweek that Sunday or the following Monday, where I speak about the right to anger, right, and rage seeping through. And I start the piece by writing, over time, fear and grief become fault lines, hastening an eruption and collective outcry for justice, which basically meant that what we were witnessing then, right, protests all over the country, protests globally, while that uprising might have been difficult to see for some, it shouldn't have been surprising to anyone, right? You can only expect people to push down such violence, endure countless downgrades to one's dignity before, the only response is an eruption of some kind. And so, when we all got together to chat, I know Amir, we spoke, you too. We're talking about kind of divisions in our community. You too, you mentioned religion, ethnic, division, and you shared a bit about uprisings taking place. Do you mind sharing a little bit about, what's currently happening in Iraq and the vulnerabilities faced in that uprising that you're seeing in the wider community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, starting October 2019, we've noticed that there has been some kind of movement led by young people, including activists, journalists, feminists, thinkers, who have simply had enough being ruled by a divisive, by a extremist religious groups motivated by violence and exclusion leading us in the government. We have people like Muqtada al-Sadr making statements linking COVID-19 to the LGBT plus community, claiming that it's God's revenge for homosexuals to exist. And that he is not the only one, and he's actually not the most surprising one. We have people who are on the Human Rights Committee in the Iraqi government who say, we've had direct conversations with them, some of which were on Twitter, very public, and they claim that LGBT plus people in Iraq do not have a space because of the morality law, which is so vague. Me drinking this bottle of water could be labeled as immoral action, and I could be facing imprisonment and a fine for. So, these kinds of leaderships that we've been having, obviously, not only in the last 20 years after the US invasion, but also even before that, having Saddam in power and other dictators one way or another. I think now the young people in general are waking up to reality and realizing that those rights that we're asking for will not be simply given to us. And we don't really live in a democracy, because even though we actually go and vote, we are only giving the same choices. Democracy doesn't start only with the right to vote. It actually starts with access and opportunities that are available for young people and people from different backgrounds and ideologies to be able to run for these offices in the first place. If you don't give people those different options, then you only give us the same faces. A prime minister is now a minister of oil, and then a minister of education is now a minister of finance. That's not a democracy. And I think that's really what people are noticing. And especially young people are realizing that the difficulties that we're facing as LGBT plus people is not really unique to only LGBT plus people. We've been the target of killing campaigns for the last couple of decades, but activists, poets, and thinkers have also been targeted in the society. And the right to life is protected both legally and religiously. And according to Islam, even if you think of it from a religious point of view, this right should be guaranteed. What's been really hopeful to see is that in certain spaces, they've even been inclusive of LGBT plus activists. I think, when it comes to race, we're certainly still behind, since we're not even recognizing the discrimination Black Iraqis are facing. We don't even recognize that they exist still as a society. And we, a lot of people actually, the minute they look at someone who has darker skin, they think, oh, this person is working as a server, or this person is actually a foreigner, is not really Iraqi, which is shameful. There is no better word to describe it. These are Iraqis, even if they actually worked in the service industry, there is no problem with that. But the problem is using that label as a way to discredit their existence in one way or another, and to justify the discrimination that they face. We're certainly, again, hopeful with the young movement that's been happening, which has been more limited because of COVID-19, but the spark is definitely started, and people have taken the fight to social media and online when possible, and they go back to the streets every time they announce that it's possible for people to be out. And I think it's going to be hard for us to go back to the older Iraq, whatever that means. It could be a lot better in the future, it could be a lot worse, but we're not going back to the normal times that we've had before.
Lanaya, if you could grant me the permission, I just wanted to respond and add to what Amir has been sharing. I feel, my heart is beating even faster as I listen to what he's saying, because there has been this conscious effort to invisibilize us, like disappear us, as people of color, as Afro-descendants. And so the issues that we face get diminished because they're trying to make us just basically shrink into the background, into the darkness, literally and figuratively, and so that our issues don't then get recognized. And then if you bring in the intersectionality and then say there's a divide, so it's LGBT plus issues and that's not your issue, but then at the same time you still get discriminated against for your dark skin, and then you don't see that the person being discriminated against for their perceived or real sexual orientation is also facing discrimination for the color of their skin likewise, because the people who have fairer or lighter complexion, they have certain protections, and that has been historically the case because they might have come from a history of already privilege. They got educated, they have the cushion of being a part of the upper class and living in particular spaces. And so even though they may face some level of discrimination, they still don't face the same amount of discrimination that we will face for the color of our skin. You see? And so those are the things that we then have to constantly fight against. And so I saw someone have a question about the white agenda. The white agenda is capitalism. It is inequality. It is patriarchy. That's a white agenda. They've pushed that agenda for centuries. They haven't stopped pushing that agenda. Let's talk about that agenda. It's not about LGBT issues. It is about the fact that we have a set of people, fairer complexion, minority of the world population controlling the majority of the world's resources. And everybody's suffering is because of that. Then we have to tackle that. So when people talk about the white agenda, that's what I've spoken about openly here in my country. Religion, Christianity, that's a white agenda. That's a foreign agenda that was forced on my people. And that's been the case since then, and certainly more so now. Let's tackle that agenda. That's what I wanted to add to that.
Thank you for that. And you never have to hesitate, anyone in this panel, to contribute with such passion, your perspectives. So thank you for jumping in there. Again, while we have an audience with each of you, would love to, pick up a few of these questions we have, Q&A, that have been dropped in. There's been a flurry from the very beginning of the session. But based on what we've heard, I think, we think about what the LGBTQ movement can learn from the racial justice movement and be influenced by it. I think, now's the time to really think about how we can be better allies to one another, as a community. One question I see here from the audience is regarding this growing divide in our community. What are concrete things that can be done to mend these divisions? Would love to hear from several of you on that.
Well, let me just start by saying unity is power. That has been our strength since the beginning of time. Division is one of the things, that same foreign agenda I was talking about. It created the division among us as a people. The reason Africans could have civilized the rest of the world was because we were respectful of other human beings. And other human beings recognized and respected us for what we had already achieved. And so they absorbed and they learned from us and they worked together with us. The division, the use of all discoveries against other human beings, that is not a people of color ideology. That is an ideology of white people. That is an ideology that came from Europe and that was imposed on everybody else in the world. So when it comes to us in our own spaces and globally fighting this system, it means coming from a united front. You can't use one finger, this finger, the next finger. You have to use all of them together. That is how we're going to defeat this. We have to be united. So even though I saw a question asking about, in the case of Belize, how do we get the Equal Opportunities Bill on the table, is we get everybody on the table to be there pushing for it, because it is not, like I said, 19 protected characteristics. So all the people that are affected by discrimination in the country and all the organizations that represent them need to be at the table pushing the bill, because discrimination is not unique to a particular group of persons. All Afro-descendants that their sons are being put into prison just because of their dark skin. We have to work together to see that this is something that's affecting us collectively, and it is collectively that we will be able to solve it. We cannot continue to be divided, or they will continue to be successful against us.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for that. I would also just piggyback on that and go back to a comment that Beverly made and alluded to at the beginning. And, you know, when I think about what are the concrete things that we need to do as a movement, I do think about the question, Linnea, of what can we learn from the racial justice movement? Because the queer movement is a younger movement. And we've seen, you know, the fight for racial justice take different paths and look different all across the globe. But one of the things that I think about when I think about what we've learned and what the racial justice movement has learned is the point that, you know, it doesn't stop with legal equality. And so, you know, what we found is that, you know, just demanding the legal rights, the laws on the books has never been the thing that is going to get the lived equality, the actual liberation for people of color, for Black and Brown people, for people who are more marginalized. And so our movement has to really think about how do we center and prioritize making sure that the reality of life for the Black trans women, for the, you know, the immigrant folks in our countries, for the people of color who are often invisible, when we take care of them and make sure that they have the liberation, the self-determination, the justice that they need, everyone else will follow, right? We will all be taken care of. And that also means that our movement has to look differently. Our leadership has to look differently in our movement. We are not going to address the issues of Black trans women unless more Black trans women are in leadership roles all across the globe in our movement and have the resources and the power to set the agenda and to set policy and to determine what change looks like. And then I also think about, you know, one of the things that we can be doing concretely around that is making sure that when people, one, that there are pipelines to that leadership for people, that we're intentionally building a path and creating a path for people to move into leadership. And then once they get into that leadership, that they are that they get to determine what kind of support that they need to be able to succeed. And I think a lot of times we think about, okay, well, you know, people will think about, well, what works for them, but that's not necessarily going to work for people of color in leadership. And so people of color have to be able to set the stage and say, this is what we need in leadership.
So to that point, Bev, that pipeline to leadership, right? As we pursue that, there's actually a question here in the Q&A where someone asks, and I'd be interested to get everyone's perspectives. You know, could you all speak to how class works in these contexts, right? We realize having kind of having this pipeline of leaders will make an impact. But the person asked, you know, how class works in these contexts, but also what are the experiences or how the experiences of not only white bodies, but elites of color, as they write, in this context compared to others in the community, the more marginalized queers of color in the community.
I'd like to say, first of all, that it's even hard to get them involved because they're protected by their class position. So getting them even involved in the movement, first of all, is a challenge. And I can certainly speak to that when it comes to, for example, work that I've done over the years with Petal and trying to get LB women who are of the upper class to support the work of the organization. Oftentimes, the attitude generally is that, well, they don't need to come to conversations or the kind of things that we offer because, you know, they're above that. They don't necessarily want to be a part of the organization or come to the activities. They don't want to be seen with us because, you know, you're grassroots, you're poor people. We're not poor people. We're not those kind of people. So class definitely plays a role. You see it in the movement, and not only within the LGBT, but other movements in the country. Once it's poor people, then the people who have the privilege of their ethnic as well as their academic class, they tend to stay on the side. Now, I do have to say that there's a ray of hope, because it was also that same class of persons that supported the Section 53, pushing it and educating and so on. So clearly, if people set aside their privileges, they can certainly use it to support the work that is being done by the groups that experience the marginalization. You see, when you come from a particular family, even if people might discriminate against LGBT, being LGBT, because you're a part of this particular family and you have wealth, then you're not going to go through the kind of things that a person who is poor will go through, or a person who is of color will go through. You see, so it changes the impact on persons. So we need everybody, again, you see, right back to the whole thing of solidarity. If you as a person, no matter what your class, recognize that every human being deserves to live in dignity, every human being deserves to have their rights respected, then it should be easy to support that work to ensure that we have that kind of society. And the challenge is getting persons to do that, to recognize that, to live that, to act in that way. But then it would also force that person to say, well, can I be comfortable in the privileged position that I'm in? You see, and that's a deeper analysis and a deeper change that then we're asking people to make, and we can only pray that they would make that change.
Yeah. Ditsy, I see you shaking your head yes around the class topic.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there to just say, you know, what we're dealing with for me is a little bit more difficult, because for people to set aside their privileges, they first need to acknowledge their privilege. And I think we're dealing with situations where in South Africa, we talk of white privilege, we speak of male privilege, we speak of, you know, cis gay male privilege. And you have people saying, I'm not privileged. I've also had to work hard to get. And until there's a recognition of what this privilege is and how it plays itself out, then it is going to be very difficult for us to even begin to say, set it aside. I am able to say that my lighter tone, even though I'm born in Soweto and grew up amongst my much darker siblings and relatives, has pushed a little bit. It does not mean that I have not had to work. It just means I'm a little bit more palatable to the powers that be. Acknowledging that means that I'm able to then use that privilege, that little bit of privilege that I have, to open whatever doors that I'm able to open for everyone else around me. But this needs to be acknowledged. The racists in my country will say things like, I don't see race. The minute someone says that, that means you're not seeing how else race plays itself out on my body, on my life. And therefore, that is a change that we need to begin to also push, to say to those who say they don't see race, that means you are then not seeing how you yourself are a part of the problem. And we need to be undoing so much of that within our own communities, that to have people acknowledge and see. And I think you were talking about the pipeline to leadership positions. Thing is, representation should not be a replacement for systemic change, because we also have seen and we know how power and proximity to power changes people, because then there is so much more to lose. That even those who are in positions where they've been placed in order to be representative start actually towing the line. We know how capitalism works. We've seen it. We know how we call it soft life. You know, soft life is wonderful. I mean, you find people that are passionate, who have been placed in positions where they're supposed to be representative, and they then have a soft life, and therefore there's too much to lose, and they don't want to rock the boat and upset the apple cart. So what we need to be doing, in my opinion, as Ifashina has said, is really the level of solidarity, but also a much deeper, clear, and conscious effort on all our parts to understand our vision, and to be able to say, also to call ourselves in and to call ourselves out, because I don't know if we do that enough. I know that we're not doing that enough in our own communities, because some of our leaders are problematic, and some of our leaders are the ones that hurt us the most, because these are the people who are in positions where they're able to use the pipeline but don't. So gatekeeping is a very, very big issue. And so we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but I am, to be honest, very optimistic, because here we are having conversations that generally we don't have. That excites me.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Bev Ditsi. So we have a few more minutes together, and I would love to, we're reflecting on 2020, which has been an extraordinary year. On a more optimistic note, I would love to hear from each of you, 1 minute, what you've observed, and what gives you hope for positive change, a final thought. And I'm going to start with Amir, because I'm going to, since there was so much activity in the Q&A and questions asked, this one was pointed at you. So if you can wrap that, what's your view of what gives you hope for positive change, and also reply to this question. The question comes in, says, what is your suggestion for Iraqi LGBT individuals who live in Iraq and do not fit in? And then, maybe, highlight what Iraq here is doing to put pressure and support the community there in the fight for freedom for this individual. I think it's worth you responding.
Absolutely. I think, in terms of what we do a lot. We can go on the website and you can find everything in 3 languages, Arabic and Kurdish and English. So I'm not gonna go too much in depth in that. But in terms of fitting in, we're not meant to fit in. We're meant to shake up the boat, and we're meant to shake things up, not only for queer people, but for everyone. The problem that we have in Iraq is that we've all been thinking about, how do I fit in? And at the end, the system that we have of fitting in does not work for anyone, even straight men, actually. Women, children, people with disabilities, people of color, queer people. None of us fit in. It's an abusive system that is not meant to continue. And on a, to both talk about hopeful things and to link it to what my colleagues were saying, I think it's time for the queer community to think away from charging $150 for a concert for queer people to go during Pride and pay so much money for a famous singer to come when that money can be the annual budget of a grassroots organization somewhere in the world. So I think, what's great about 2020, yes, it's been terrible to lose so many people to COVID-19 and to see people getting COVID-19. But what's great is that access has increased for people. We see here more than 1,400 people registering for OutSummit. If it was in person, that would not have been the case. And we saw World Pride earlier, videos from all over the world, performances, activists, everyone going back to the roots of what Pride means, moving away from just having Madonna and other famous people headline a Pride event when I don't care who's singing in Pride when people in Iraq are being killed. Give me that money so we offer safe housing for those people. Instead of paying them that money, donate to any of the organizations you see here, including Outright, that can use that money to provide housing and so many other things to respond to COVID-19. And I'm hoping that people are waking up to the political side of human rights and LGBT plus rights during 2020, because we've been forced to do it. We can't have concerts online. We're forced to just focus on the more political side of it. And hopefully that continues in the coming years.
Great. One final thought.
I just like to say in response, I saw Caleb had mentioned fence sitting, and I am all about fence scaling. So since we have gatekeeping to deal with, let's master the skill of scaling fences and breaking down barriers completely so that we can achieve the rights that are due to us as human beings in this world.
Great, thank you. We have a final minute. If Bev Tillery or Bev Ditzy has a final thought.
Thanks to Amir for those comments. I think one of the things that I am heartened by related to what Amir said is I think that we are in a moment where we are about to be ready to let go of respectability politics. And we understand that in a system of white supremacy, that only means that we are going to prioritize the needs of white men. We no longer, it was never beneficial to us. And I think people are realizing that if we're going to move forward as a movement, our work has to be, again, rooted in one, calling out and naming and addressing those deep roots of oppression. So racism has to be a part of the language that we're talking about, and our work to dismantle racism is intrinsically connected to our work around queer liberation. So I'm excited about this moment. I'm excited about the way that Black women are saving the globe, and that we're seeing that over and over again.
There's a shift, and I am very happy with the shift. There's a shift. There's a realization that our lives have been a lie. Capitalism doesn't work. This supremacy is bullshit. Excuse my language. I don't also subscribe to propriety very much, because that is part of trying to keep us in check. This particular year, even with COVID, has been, it's very hard to say that it's been a good year when it has been, but blessings are blessings. I was able to make a film where I was able to speak to 24 individuals, 24 activists from around the world. That would never have happened had it not been for the global lockdown. And as a result, the film Lesbians Free Everyone, which is about the Beijing conference and the big lesbian visibility campaign that happened at that conference that very few people know about because of a very conscious invisibilization of the lesbian identity across our media. And so the film is out, and we will be sharing more information on that to make sure that it is as accessible, as widely accessible as possible. And that would not have happened had it not been for this particular time that we're living in. And so there are some blessings. And yes, we are changing the world. We see where we need to go, and we are changing the world. And I'm very excited. And the solidarity, the fact that we keep getting together across different parts of the globe, means that we actually can do this. We are so much stronger than they are.
Well, this has been a powerful and extraordinary exchange of ideas. You know, there has been a shift. This is indeed a moment. And I think all of us, today should, take away what we've heard today, right? In order to set aside your privilege, you have to acknowledge it, right? The moment that I think I agree with Beth Tillery, letting go of responsibility politics. It's powerful, and every human being deserves to live with dignity. I think that is a great place for us to, one, be considerate of time, but just hold the conversation right there. I do want to thank you panelists, each of you, for sharing your perspectives, for sharing yourselves with us this afternoon. And with that, I will hand things back to the Outright team.
Thank you, Linnea. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.